It was a cold winter's eve in March of 1989. People from all over the Gallatin Valley were huddled together in the warmth of a small middle school auditorium. The auditorium was abuzz with great expectations for the famous piano soloist George Winston had come to town. He'd recently become an overnight sensation throughout the United States. His albums, with their gently hammered melodies, were a calming muse for a frazzled culture. Now the house lights were brought low, and with it a sudden hush came over the auditorium. But there was no applause, as a disheveled-looking middle-aged man shuffled, stocking-footed, onto the stage. Slowly he moved around this big concert grand piano, repositioning it, playing a couple of chords, but then, like a mechanic, he leaned in under the grand piano's big hood and started plucking the strings. What in the world was he doing? Well, the man then shuffled back behind the dark velvet curtains. Well, people started to laugh, probably saying to themselves, is this like some kind of joke, right? Well, unless you know, perhaps it was a stagehand, thought some, perhaps doing a sound check or something. So everyone went back to their banter again, all abuzz. No, of course, this couldn't be George Winston. I mean, he didn't look at all like a famous recording artist. No bling or Grammy-like pizzazz. I mean, this guy was bearded with these thick black glasses, a tired old flannel shirt hanging out over his torn blue jeans, and he had a big hole in his sweater. And of course, those wool socks with a toe or two sticking out. Yeah, must be some kind of stagehand. Great expectations indeed. Ha. A few minutes later, the disheveled-looking man shuffled back onto the stage and seated himself at the piano bench. In spite of their disrespectful banter, he made no overture to get the audience's attention. He just closed his eyes and began to cradle some chords with a touch only a maestro can muster. Then came this huge collective gasp, a hush. No more banter, only the sounds of a mellifluous melody that made all mortal flesh keep silent. For all of us there in that auditorium knew it was George Winston. And we had ears to hear and eyes to see. And so it is in our gospel story for this weekend from the 8th chapter of St. Mark. The disciples were also huddled around in great expectation in the city of Caesarea Philippi, just a few miles northeast of the Sea of Galilee. For now nearly 3 years, people all over Galilee and the surrounding regions were abuzz about this Jesus of Nazareth, who not only taught about the kingdom of God is at hand, but also put those hands where his mouth was, casting out demons, healing the deaf and blind, making lepers spotless, and even raising a little girl from the dead. Talitha cumi, he said, with but a word. And so that day in Caesarea Philippi, Jesus now pauses before setting his face toward Jerusalem and asks the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And applauding, Peter answered, "You're the Christ, the long-awaited Messiah." But then Jesus quickly charged them not to tell anyone about him. Reverse psychology? Hardly. For Jesus then went on to teach them what being the Christ and being a disciple ultimately means. And at that explanation, Peter's applause turned to a hush. "No way, you've got to be kidding, right?" said he. So 2 questions for you to ponder before we gather this weekend for worship. Number 1, why would Jesus charge the disciples not to tell anyone about his being the Christ, the Messiah, at this point in his ministry? And 2, what are the great expectations of the disciples that found such a strong reaction from Peter and a rebuke from Jesus to get behind him, not out ahead. Friends and family of First Lutheran, come and join us for worship this coming weekend to hear where Jesus is calling his disciples to follow, and us as well in our own generation. You can join us at 5 p.m. in person on Saturday evening, or on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. in person. That's also live streamed, or again on Sunday morning at 11 in person with our usual telecast on KSFY TV. And so God's grace to you this day and always.